Hello and welcome once again to the course Life of Christ. Now we're moving on to class 42, a two-part class in which we discuss Jesus and the Jewish feasts. We're going to divide this into the spring feasts and the fall feast, and also try to connect them with the Christian calendar as well. So let's begin with Jesus and the spring feast. If you looked at the whole calendar year for the Jews, this is how the feasts would line up. You'd have Passover in the spring, usually around our March or April, corresponds to our Holy Week. And then you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread right next to it in the calendar. Then you have the Feast of the First Fruits, and then you have the Feast of Weeks at Pentecost. So those are the spring feast, and these first three are pretty close together. And then you have about 50 days, and then you have the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost. Then after that, you wait at least 2 months usually, and then you have the fall feast as well. And so you see some of the symbols that help you understand some of the meanings of the feast and what they're for. And so we're going to go through these one by one. And what we want to do is compare, first of all, what was the original Jewish feast, the purpose of the celebration, some of the passages in which you can find descriptions of the feast, the point of the feast for the Jews. And then we want to go and compare that to the time of Jesus and also then the time of the church today. Okay, so let's begin. Here's another comparison that has to do with the Jewish calendar and the entire Christian era. It's a different way of looking at it where you say, okay, usually these feasts all happened in 1 year for the Jews. But when we think about the time of the church over the centuries, then these feasts for the Jews can be connected to different key events in Christian history. And so, for example, you'd have Passover connected to the crucifixion of Jesus, unleavened bread to Christ in the grave, first fruits to the resurrection, and so on. But the difference is that where all these feasts happen in 1 year for the Jews, then the second coming obviously is at the end of history and hasn't happened yet. And so this covers hundreds of years if you compare it to the Christian calendar. So we start off with the Feast of Passover, and I'll always put the passages at the top of the slide so you can go to any one of those that you want. And I'm going to assume a basic knowledge that you have of the feast and of some of the stories. If you don't know anything about them, then you can pause the video and then you can read the passages. Most of these are pretty short, just a few verses, and it tells what the Jews were supposed to do with each one of the feasts, when the feast was, what the priests did, what the people did, how they celebrated, what it was for, etc. And so we start off with the idea of Passover, which began way back in Exodus 12, when God was freeing the Israelites from Egypt. And he sent Moses to bring them out, had the plagues, and then the last plague was the one where the firstborn of the Egyptians was going to be killed. And in order to prevent any firstborn of the Israelites from being killed, God said to the Israelites, take a lamb and kill the lamb, and then take its blood, and with the lamb's blood, paint blood on the doorframe of your houses. And when the angel of the Lord is sent from the Lord and sees the blood that's painted on the door frames of your houses, then that angel will pass over the houses and your firstborn will be safe. And so that's what happened. And so that night of the Passover, they ate the Passover meal, having painted the lamb's blood on their door frames, and they were eating the lamb and some other things as well that we'll talk about later in another class. And the angel passed over, and so that's where it gets its name. In Hebrew, another name for it is Pesach, for suffering, and obviously you can see the connection there as well. And so the idea is of sacrifice that produces freedom. And so again, you have the firstborn of the Egyptians being killed, in a sense a sacrifice, but more a punishment really. And then you have the Israelites gaining their freedom as well. And then you see here what they would do with the door frame. They would put it on both sides of the door, and then they'd put it above the door. so that if you connected all three of those blood stains together, it would form a triangle pointing upward. And it symbolized that this, in a sense, was a sacrifice up to God. They sacrificed the lamb. They remembered what God was doing and freeing them from Israel. So it was an upward sacrifice. Now, if you go on and compare it to then what Jesus did on the cross, you have, again, the blood of the lamb being put in three places, on the two hands, and then also where the blood ran from his feet. And again, if you join those together, you have a downward pointing triangle, which God sends his son to die for the world, his lamb to die for us. And in a sense, it's a downward sacrifice. Now, the interesting thing that one person pointed out is that if you take both of these triangles and you superimpose one of the triangles over another, this is what you get. You get the Star of David, which is the star of the Jewish nation of Israel, even today. So that's an interesting combination there with that. So that is a representation then of Passover. Then you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which comes hard on the heels of Passover. Really, it's part of the same week. And in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, what was celebrated here is the day that the seed was planted in the earth. And in that day, when the seed is planted in the earth, then the Jews pray to God for the coming harvest, because they've just begun. And so they want the earth to produce bread eventually from the seeds they're planting. And so that's the prayer that they make in the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay? And so you go on then, and you go to Jesus' time again, and you see that Matthew 27 describes the crucifixion of Jesus. And then it says, then they buried Jesus in the earth. And so the Feast of Unleavened Bread that year happened on the day that they buried Jesus in the earth. And this Messiah was without sin, and unleavened bread represented for the Jews the absence of sin in their lives. They took out all the yeast that would be leavening the bread normally. They would take it all out for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and they would get rid of it from their homes. And the symbolism was, we're trying to get rid of anything unclean, anything that's sinful. And so you have Jesus as the Messiah, the perfect man who lived perfectly, fulfilled the law perfectly. He is without sin, and so he is buried in the ground. And some would say he wasn't buried, he was planted, as if he were the seeds that planted in the ground, and that they die, and then they bring forth life, as he talked about in John chapter 12, as Paul maybe refers to in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. So some great symbolism there as well. And then you have the Feast of First Fruits, okay? And again, this is pretty soon afterwards. And so you have the first fruits of the harvest that are given to the Lord. And the Jews are blessing God because the first part of the harvest has arrived as a promise of what is to come, okay? And so when you talk about first fruits, it's the very first things you get from the harvest. The whole harvest hasn't arrived yet. You still have most of the harvest yet to reap, and it may be a while before you get to do it, okay? And then if you look what happens then on the Sunday, then you have that year that the Feast of the First Fruits was celebrated on the Sunday, okay? And then what happens on that first day of the week? Then Jesus is resurrected from the grave that Sunday, and 1 Corinthians 15:20 refers to Jesus as the first fruits of those who are risen from the dead. And that's a promise of the resurrection that's waiting for all of us, okay? So he's the first fruits. He's the very first thing, the first thing God has resurrected from the ground, and it's a promise of what's to come. And so again, just great symbolism there as well. So none of this is a coincidence, because it's not every year. In fact, it's pretty rare that all of these three first feast days occur in the same week, and they almost never occur back to back to back, okay? But on the day of Passover that year, when Jesus died, then when the lamb is sacrificed for the Jews that year, that same time Christ dies on the cross. And then on the day of unleavened bread, when the seed is planted, then Christ is buried or planted. And then on that same day of first fruits that year, the first harvest, Christ rises from the dead. So it's not a coincidence that it happens on those 3 consecutive days. Pretty interesting story there as well. And then you have what's called the Feast of Pentecost, or Feast of Weeks in the Bible. And you have here some stories that are juxtaposed together, where you have the story of Mount Sinai, which is the first Pentecost ever, and you have Moses and fire, darkness, the trumpet, the quaking, thunder, lightning. This was the Old Testament Pentecost, okay? And the 10 Commandments and the law then were given to Moses on that first Pentecost day at Mount Sinai. And it was the time of the beginning of the late harvest, okay? So in a sense, you could say that the Jews were receiving part of the harvest. It was a gift from the Lord, a new covenant that God was making with them on Mount Sinai on that first Pentecost, okay? And then you also have at Mount Zion later on, you have Jesus there who's finished his ministry. You have the tongues of fire, a rushing mighty wind. In other words, those 2 Pentecosts were maybe as much as 1,400 years apart, at least 1,250 years apart, and yet they're very, very similar, okay? And so you see again in the Acts 2 version, then you have the Holy Spirit coming down, and it says with a rushing wind, and then the flame that divided into, or the fire that divided into tongues of flame that then appeared on the heads of at least the apostles and perhaps on the 120, because it's in the same context without the chapter separation of the meeting of the 120 that selected Matthias as the replacement apostle for Judas. It's that same general context. And so again, that happened on Pentecost as well. And you have many of the same characteristics that happened on the first Pentecost at Sinai repeated then on this Pentecost in Jerusalem. And so you have, for example, some interesting connections between that first Shavuot there. It's called the Feast of Weeks. That comes from the Hebrew word for weeks, and the Pentecost in Jerusalem. The first Pentecost on Sinai happened 50 days after the Exodus. And you have this other Pentecost in Jerusalem that happens 50 days after the cross. You have the 10 Commandments given on the first Pentecost. And then Peter preaches the word about the Word, capital W, Jesus, who is the final word from God. And he initiates a new covenant with the beginning of the church in Acts 2. Then you also have Moses coming down from the mountain after he receives the law, and he's coming down, and at first he's probably really happy and eager to share the law with the people. And then as he comes down the mountain, then he hears noise that he doesn't like. It almost sounds like it's a war in the camp. And then he realizes the people have completely forgotten about God and started to create a different God. And so he gets down to the camp and he finds the golden calf and he finds the broken covenant. And so he actually symbolizes the breaking of the covenant by taking those tablets of stone and smashing them on the ground and then grinding them up and putting it in water and making the people drink it, okay? And yet then when you have Jesus mentioned in the sermon by Peter in Acts 2, it's not a golden calf. It's Jesus who's the true Lamb of God. And instead of a broken covenant and people leaving God already, you have a new covenant given to the people that's accepted. And so at the end of the first story on the first Pentecost, there's punishment by death for about 3,000 people, the text says in Exodus 32. And you have the parallel in the Pentecost at Jerusalem, where 3,000 people then accept the gospel and are baptized that day in Jerusalem. Now again, this is not a coincidence. I think God carefully planned out the timing and also all these details, and there's probably many more as well. But these are some of the most striking comparisons between that first Pentecost and then the second Pentecost. All right. So hopefully that's helpful to you for understanding the connections between the first spring feasts of the Jews and then some of the key events of the early Christian faith, and even down into the church today, what they mean for us. So in the next class then, we'll look at the fall feast. See you then.